The wind that day came crawling down from the high desert, dragging dust and memory through the dying town of Redemption Creek. Wooden signs creaked. The saloon's doors flapped like tired lungs. It was the kind of town that forgot what mercy looked like. Eli Boone rode in slow, his hat low, his horse buckshot breathing heavy beneath him. The road stretched thin and pale, like a scar across the land. Eli had seen plenty of scars, on himself, on others, on the world. He didn't come looking for trouble. But trouble, it seemed, had a nose for men like him. He dismounted near the general store, dust trailing behind his boots. A few locals stopped talking long enough to measure him. His sunburned face, his rough hands, the long coat that carried the smell of gunpowder and rain. Clyde Mercer, the storekeeper, looked him up and down before turning away, already judging. Inside, the air hung heavy with grain dust and tobacco smoke. Two ranchers leaned against the counter, laughing about something mean. And in the middle of it all stood Ayanna. She wasn't like the others. Her stillness made her stand out. Her hair, black as a crow's wing, was braided with a single turquoise bead. The long sleeves of her faded dress brushed against wrists scarred from years of labor. She spoke softly, her voice trembling yet dignified. "I'll take a bag of oats, and salt, if you got any left." Clyde's mouth curled. "Don't serve her. She's Apache. Her kind don't pay honest." The room fell quiet. The two ranchers chuckled, spitting tobacco into the sawdust. Ayanna's hands stayed still, though her eyes hardened. Dark, deep, unyielding. Eli watched it all from the doorway. Something inside him stirred, something he thought long dead, the part of him that still gave a damn. He stepped forward. "Didn't know you started turning folks away for being born different," he said, voice calm but cold. Clyde snorted. "Ain't your business, mister." Eli looked at Ayanna, then back at the man. "Then I'm making it my business." A silence settled, sharp as a knife's edge. One of the ranchers, Cole Harlow, grinned with that slow cruelty born from power. "You talk big for a drifter," he said. "Maybe you ain't learned who runs things around here." Eli's gaze didn't waver. "Guess I'll find out." He dropped 2 coins on the counter. "That's for the ladies' oats, and mine." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Cole lunged forward, shoving Eli's shoulder. The room tensed like a held breath. Eli didn't reach for his gun. He didn't have to. One quiet look from him was enough to drain the color from Cole's face. There was something in those eyes, something cold and haunted, like the silence before a storm. Ayanna picked up her bag of oats and left without a word. As she stepped into the sun, the light caught on the turquoise bead in her hair. It glimmered like a promise that refused to die. Eli followed a few minutes later. The heat slapped his face, but the image of her didn't fade. She moved with a grace that didn't belong to a place like Redemption Creek, like someone who carried her own sky. From across the street, Marshal Wade Harlow watched everything. His badge caught the light, but there was no justice behind it, only ambition. He chewed his cigar, eyes narrowing. He'd built his little empire out of fear, and he didn't take kindly to strangers stirring up sympathy. That night, Eli lodged his horse at Amos Granger's ranch, a few miles out. Amos was an old friend from the war, gruff, steady, one of the few good men left. Over supper, the old rancher wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Heard you ruffled the Harlows today." Eli gave a tired smile. "Didn't plan on it." Amos poured whiskey into tin cups. "This town's rotten from the inside. Best not go sticking your boots too deep. Wade Harlow's the law here, far as he's concerned, and his brother Cole's the devil that enforces it." Eli nodded, but his thoughts wandered back to Ayanna, the quiet defiance in her eyes, the way she didn't beg. Outside, the prairie wind moaned like an old ghost. The smell of sage and ash hung in the air. Eli sat on the porch, staring at the stars, remembering the night he'd lost his wife, Clara, and their little girl, Mary Lynn, to fire. It had burned quick, hungry, and final. Since then, he'd been drifting, chasing distance, running from memory. He whispered, "Ain't much left to lose." But deep down, something new was stirring, something he didn't trust. Morning came painted in gold and dust. Eli saddled Buckshot and rode toward the edge of town. The desert rolled out before him, endless and hollow. He found himself near a small patch of land. Ayanna's place. A cabin of rough-cut logs, smoke rising from the chimney, a small garden fenced with crooked sticks. She was outside, cutting wood. The sound of her axe echoed through the still air. When she noticed him, she froze, gripping the handle tighter. "I came to return your change," Eli said, holding out a few coins. "I don't take charity," she replied, voice sharp as flint. "It ain't charity," he said, "just fairness." For a long second they stood there, two lonely shapes framed by morning light and the smell of pine smoke. Then she sighed and took the coins. "You shouldn't have stood up for me yesterday. They'll make trouble for you." Eli shrugged. "They make trouble for everyone sooner or later." Her eyes softened, almost reluctantly. "You're not from here?" "No, ma'am, just passing through." "Then keep passing," she said quietly. "This place eats the good ones first." He tipped his hat. "I've been eaten before." For the first time, a hint of a smile ghosted across her lips. "Then you might just fit in." He rode off, the wind pushing at his coat, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and something else. Hope, maybe. By sunset, the whispers had already started. The saloon filled with talk of the stranger who stood up for the Apache widow. Marshal Harlow heard every word. He leaned on the bar, voice low and measured. "Find out what he wants," he told his deputy, Slim Redden. "Men like that don't wander into town for nothing." Out in the distance, under a bleeding red sky, Eli set camp by the river. He watched the flames flicker, his mind tangled between the past and the woman who carried her grief like armor. The night creatures called, and the old desert seemed to listen. Somewhere, deep in the darkness, the old ones whispered through the wind, unseen, ancient, patient. Eli Boone closed his eyes, unaware that his crossing paths with Ayanna would change the fate of Redemption Creek forever. Sometimes, God don't send angels. He sends the broken, 'cause they're the only ones desperate enough to fight. The next few weeks rolled by like wind across the plains, slow, steady, and heavy with unspoken things. Eli Boone stayed on at Amos Granger's ranch, mending fences, fixing wagons, hauling feed. It was work that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet most days. Every sunrise came the same way. A red slit over the hills, the low moan of cattle, the smell of dust and hay. But some mornings, when the wind shifted from the east, he could smell smoke from Ayanna's cabin, the faint trace of sage and cedar that she burned to greet the spirits. And each time he caught it, something in him stirred, a memory he couldn't name, a pull he couldn't fight. Amos Granger was the kind of man who believed silence could fix more than words ever could. He had a busted knee from a cavalry skirmish and a heart too big for a town like Redemption Creek. One afternoon, as Eli leaned against the corral rails, Amos limped up with 2 mugs of coffee. "Been hearing talk down in town," Amos said, handing him a cup. "Marshal Harlow's got his eye on you. Word is he don't like drifters meddling where they don't belong." Eli blew the steam from his cup, not looking at him. "You think I give a damn about what Harlow likes?" "I think you don't want to end up 6 feet under his rules," Amos said gently. "That man runs this valley like a king. He don't forgive. He don't forget." Eli didn't answer. He watched a hawk glide above the canyon rim, its shadow sweeping over the prairie grass. "I ain't looking for a fight, Amos." "Maybe not," Amos said, "but trouble's looking for you." That evening, Eli rode out with a small bundle of tools tied behind his saddle. The road took him past Ayanna's land, a small square of stubborn soil fenced by hope more than wood. He saw her in the distance, bent over her field, pulling weeds from between dry corn stalks. He stopped at the fence. "You'll ruin your back doing it that way," he said. She straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "It's the only way that works." He climbed down, walked over, and dropped to one knee beside her. "Try using a hoe with a longer handle, less strain." Ayanna looked at him, amused. "You're an expert on farming now?" Eli smiled faintly. "Used to be." Her expression softened. "Before the gun or after?" He hesitated, eyes distant. "Before the fire." She said nothing more, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It hummed with something neither could name. When they finished clearing the row, Ayanna lit a small fire and boiled water for coffee. Eli sat across from her, the twilight stretching long shadows between them. "You know they talk about you," he said quietly. "They've always talked," she replied. "White men in town think the land should forget we were ever here." Eli looked into the fire. "You ain't afraid?" "Fear's a habit you either break or it kills you," she said. "I broke mine when they killed Coda." Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes shone with something deeper than grief. Something carved from years of surviving. Eli took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I'm sorry for what they did." Ayanna nodded, stirring the pot. "Sorry don't change much, but it matters when it's said right." Later that night, when Eli rode back toward the ranch, he found Slim Redden waiting near the trail. The deputy's grin was slick and mean. "Marshal Harlow wants a word," Slim said. "Tell him I ain't got nothing to say." Slim spat tobacco near Eli's boot. "Don't make me repeat myself, Cowboy." Eli's hand rested on the butt of his Colt. "You sure you want to test me tonight?" For a moment, Slim's grin faltered. Then he stepped back, feigning courtesy. "Suit yourself. Just remember, Harlow don't take kindly to folks mixing with Apache women." Eli's jaw tightened. "Then he can choke on his own damn opinions." He rode on without another word, but the anger burned slow and deep. The old world might have changed its borders, but hate hadn't moved an inch. The next few days brought a strange quiet. Redemption Creek always felt heavy, but now it was heavier, like the land itself was holding its breath. Rumors drifted like dust. Someone had been scouting the ridge above Ayanna's land at night. Footprints by her barn. A missing goat. Eli didn't ask permission. He just showed up one evening with a rifle slung across his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here," Ayanna said, meeting him at the gate. "I ain't leaving you out here alone," he said simply. "I've been alone before." "Not like this," he replied. The firelight caught his face, and she saw something in his eyes that wasn't pity. It was duty, the kind a man carries when he's already buried too many ghosts. They sat by the fire together, listening to the wind hum through the cracks in the walls. Buckshot snorted outside. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. Ayanna broke the silence. "The Harlows want the land. It's not about me. It's about the water underneath it. My husband died for it." Eli stared into the flames. "Then we make sure he didn't die for nothing." She gave him a long, unreadable look. "You talk like a man who's still looking for redemption." He gave a dry laugh. "Redemption's a place that don't exist." Ayanna's eyes softened. "Maybe not for most, but maybe for you." At dawn, Eli found the prints again. 3 horses, all fresh, heading from the ridge toward town. He followed them until the sun turned white and cruel, leading straight to the saloon stables. Inside, Cole Harlow leaned against a post, drinking whiskey, his smirk wide as a canyon. "You got business here, Boone?" "Yeah," Eli said. "You been sneaking around Ayanna's land? Why?" Cole's grin widened. "'Cause it ain't hers. Apache land don't belong to nobody." Eli's voice dropped low. "That's where you're wrong." Cole stepped forward, nose to nose. "Careful, Drifter. You're stirring dust that'll choke you." The punch came quick. A flash of anger, a crack of bone. Eli didn't swing first, but he finished it. Cole hit the ground, bleeding from his lip, his pride broken worse than his jaw. As Eli turned to leave, he saw Marshal Wade Harlow watching from the doorway, cigar smoldering. "You just bought yourself a heap of trouble, son," the marshal said. Eli adjusted his hat. "Then I'll pay in lead if I have to." That night, Rain came in thin, silver sheets, hissing against the earth. Eli sat in the barn, oiling his rifle, while Amos Granger stood by the door, shaking his head. "You keep walking this path, Eli, you won't come back from it." Eli didn't look up. "Ain't about coming back. It's about standing still for once." Amos sighed. "You remind me of a wild horse. Don't know if you're running from something or toward it." Eli smiled faintly. Maybe both. When morning broke, Redemption Creek was quieter than ever. But under the hush, something dangerous was moving. Ayanna's garden had been trampled in the night, her chicken coop torn apart. On her door, someone had carved a single word with a knife. Leave. She stood there staring at it as Eli rode up, his jaw set like stone. "They want you scared," he said. "I don't scare easy," she replied. He touched the carved word, tracing its edges. "Maybe not, but I do." Their eyes met, tired, fierce, unspoken promises between them. Around them, the desert stretched endless and waiting. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rumbled, not rain this time, but war coming. Out here, justice don't come easy. Sometimes it wears a badge, sometimes a gun, and sometimes it just rides in on a tired horse, hoping to do one thing right before the dust takes him. The sky that day carried the weight of bad omens. The kind of clouds that rolled in low, swollen with thunder and things unsaid. The air itself seemed to tremble, waiting for something to break. Eli Boone rode toward Ayanna's land as the first growl of thunder shuddered across the valley. His coat flapped in the wind, rain spitting at his face. The storm had been building all week, so had everything else. By the time he reached her cabin, the sky had gone black and mean. Sheets of rain came sideways, slashing through the dry earth. Her small garden was already half swallowed by mud. She was outside, trying to save what she could, tying down the fence posts against the wind. "Get inside!" Eli shouted, jumping off buckshot and rushing to her side. "I can't leave it," she started, but another crack of thunder silenced her. Eli grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the cabin. "You can't fight the sky, Ayanna!" They stumbled inside just as the storm unleashed everything it had. The door slammed behind them, rattling on its hinges. Rain hammered the roof like bullets. For a moment, neither spoke. Their breath came hard. The only light came from the fire burning low in the hearth, casting trembling shadows across the room. "You shouldn't have come," she said finally, voice low but shaking. Eli took off his hat, dripping wet, his hair plastered to his forehead. "You'd rather I let the storm take you?" "I don't need savin'," she said, crossing her arms. "Not from the weather, not from men." Eli smiled faintly. "Didn't come to save you. Came to stand with you." That quiet answer seemed to disarm her more than a shout ever could. She turned away, stirring the fire, feeding it dry wood until the flames climbed high enough to paint the walls in gold. He stood there watching her, the way her shoulders tensed with pride and pain, the way she moved like someone who'd learned to trust no one but the earth itself. The wind howled outside, bending the old cabin's frame. Inside, it was warm and close. Too close. After a while, she poured 2 cups of coffee, her hands steady despite the storm's rage. "They say the earth remembers," she said quietly. "The rain, the blood, the things men do to it. Maybe that's why it cries so loud." Eli took a sip, staring into the dark liquid. Maybe. Or maybe it's just tired of being silent. She glanced at him, then away. "You sound like a man who's got ghosts of his own." He didn't answer right away. The fire popped. Wind tore at the window shutters. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and worn. "My wife's name was Clara. Our little girl was Mary Lynn. House caught fire while I was working night watch in Abilene. By the time I got back, there wasn't nothing left but smoke and a cradle full of ash." Ayanna's eyes softened. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, staring at the floor. "I left everything after that. The town, the job, even God for a spell. Figured if the Lord wanted me alive, he could damn well tell me why." For a long time, she said nothing. Then she whispered, When my husband Coda died, I buried my faith too. Thought maybe the Great Spirit had forgotten the Apache. Maybe he never meant to remember. The wind moaned around them, long and mournful, as if the whole valley was listening. Eli looked up, meeting her gaze. You ever think maybe he remembers us both through each other? Her lips parted slightly like she wanted to answer, but couldn't. Outside, the lightning flashed white, lighting up the room. For that single heartbeat, their faces were inches apart. Two people carved from loss, stitched together by the same kind of pain. Then the thunder hit, shaking the cabin to its bones. Ayanna flinched, and the coffee spilled across her hand. Eli reached for her, wrapping her fingers in his calloused ones. Easy now, he murmured. She didn't pull away, not this time. The firelight danced, soft and alive between them. The storm outside became a rhythm. Their breathing fell into step with it. The air thickened, heavy with things both holy and forbidden. She turned toward him, her eyes wet but fierce. You don't know what it's like, she said, voice trembling. To lose everything and still have to wake up. To keep walking when the world wants you gone. Eli's voice came rough. I know exactly what it's like. She shook her head, angry now. No, you don't. They took my husband, my people's land, our language. They burned what was left and called it peace. And I'm still here, just a ghost among their graves. He stood, stepping closer. Then I guess I'm a ghost too. Ayanna looked up at him, the stormlight flickering across her face. Why do you care, Eli Boone? Why keep riding into other people's fires? He hesitated, every word scraping out of him like gravel. Because I couldn't save mine. That broke something in both of them. Ayanna's breath caught, and tears welled before she could stop them. The fight left her shoulders, replaced by something raw and human. She whispered, almost too quiet to hear. I don't want to be alone tonight. Eli froze, the words cutting through him deeper than any bullet. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, until they stood close enough to feel each other's warmth against the storm's chill. His hand brushed a strand of her hair away from her cheek. You're not, he said softly. They didn't speak after that. Words would have cheapened what came next. The thunder outside grew louder, but inside the cabin the fire burned steady. Ayanna leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. He held her, gentle, reverent, as if afraid she'd disappear like smoke if he breathed too hard. Time stretched thin. Rain became a lullaby, thunder a hymn. Two broken souls found the quiet only pain can make sacred. When her tears finally stopped, she whispered, You think the world will forgive us? Eli smiled faintly, his hand still at her back. The world don't forgive, it just forgets. But maybe God remembers what the world can't. Outside, lightning flashed again, this time painting the desert in silver light. For a second, it looked almost pure. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and raw. The cabin smelled of wet wood and ashes. Ayanna moved quietly, her braid undone, her eyes calmer than they'd been in years. Eli stood by the doorway, watching the first sunlight crawl over the hills. She came to stand beside him. Neither spoke. The silence between them was full, not empty, like the earth after rain. Finally, she said, You should go before they see you here. Harlow won't rest till he breaks you. Eli nodded slowly. He can try. Ayanna turned toward the garden, her voice softer. You can't fight them all, Eli. Not forever. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, his eyes held something close to peace. Maybe not forever, but I can fight today. She reached out, touching his hand for just a moment. Warm. Real. Trembling. Then fight for something worth remembering. He tipped his hat, the brim shadowing his smile. Reckon I already found it. He rode away through the valley, the air fresh with the scent of wet sage. Behind him, the cabin stood against the rising sun like a promise made to the wind. And somewhere deep inside him, Eli Boone knew the storm hadn't ended at all. It had only just begun. A storm don't always destroy. Sometimes it washes a man clean enough to see who he really is. The rain had barely dried when the whispers began. By the third morning, everyone in Redemption Creek knew that Hank Talbot, the old rancher who owned the northern ridge, had been found dead beside his barn. Throat slit, his shotgun missing, his pockets emptied. Marshal Wade Harlow stood before the crowd in front of the saloon, his badge gleaming under the noonday sun. He had that preacher's tone of false righteousness, the kind that made men listen even when they shouldn't. "Justice will be served," he declared, voice steady, eyes sweeping across the dusty faces. "The man responsible will pay in full." He held up a blood-stained knife wrapped in a cloth. "This was found at the scene. Belongs to Eli Boone, the drifter who's been causing trouble since he set foot in my town." The murmur grew, spreading like wildfire. Folks who once just stared now pointed, spit, whispered. In a place that needed someone to blame, a stranger always fit the bill. Eli was at Amos Granger's barn when they came for him, 5 deputies, led by Slim Redden. The hammer of their rifles glinted as they surrounded him. "Easy now, boys," Eli said, his voice calm but coiled. "You sure you got the right man?" Slim grinned, that smug, oily grin that made men's fists itch. "Ain't about what's right, Boone. It's about what the marshal says is right." Before Eli could reach for his gun, they struck him from behind with a rifle butt. The world tilted, the ground swallowed him, and everything went black. He woke to the smell of rust and sweat. The jail cell was dark, one window cracked just enough to let in a strip of moonlight. Blood dried at the corner of his mouth. Vern Duffy, the drunk jailer, snored in a chair outside the bars. Eli tested the cuffs, tight, raw against his wrists. He could still feel the echo of Ayanna's voice from that stormy night, whispering she didn't want to be alone. Now it was him left alone, with nothing but ghosts and the sound of rats scratching the floorboards. The door creaked open. Slim Redden stepped in, twirling the same knife Harlow had waved in the square. "Funny thing," Slim said, his voice slick as oil. "Marshal says you killed Talbot, but me? I figure a man like you don't need much reason. Maybe that Apache woman put you up to it." Eli's eyes hardened. "You'd best leave her name out of your mouth." Slim crouched near the bars, grinning. "Oh, I struck a nerve, did I? Guess she's worth dying for, huh?" Eli lunged forward, the chains rattling as he slammed against the bars. Slim jumped back, laughing. "Easy, cowboy. You'll get your chance to swing soon enough. We're building the gallows right now." He tipped his hat and left whistling. Eli leaned his head against the cold iron. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of hammers, each strike another nail in his coffin. At the same hour, miles away, Ayanna stood in front of her cabin, the world around her still soaked with rain. She had not seen Eli since the storm. The silence scared her more than any thunder. Then Amos Granger rode up, his horse breathing hard. "They took him, Ayanna," he said, barely able to speak. "Marshal Harlow's framed him for killing Talbot." Her face went pale. "Framed?" Amos nodded. "Knife they found's his, but I'd stake my life he didn't do it. You know that." She turned toward the horizon, fists clenched. "Where's the proof?" Amos hesitated. "That's the thing. Harlow planted it. But if we could find something that ties him to Talbot's land, that might change things." Ayanna's eyes darkened like the storm that had passed. "Then we'll find it." That night, they rode under the cloak of clouds toward Talbot's ranch. The air smelled of death and damp earth. The barn still leaned half-collapsed, the dirt stained dark where the old man had fallen. Ayanna knelt near the doorway, fingers tracing the ground. She found a half-burned cigar butt crushed into the mud. "Eli doesn't smoke," she said. Amos took it, sniffed the end. "Harlow does. Smokes the same brand. Cheroots from Fort Stanton." They exchanged a look. It wasn't much, but in a town like Redemption Creek, the truth didn't need to shout. It just had to whisper loud enough to be heard by the right ears. Back at the jail, Eli sat silent as Vern Duffy stumbled in with a bottle in hand. The old man grinned through cracked teeth. Marshall says you hang at dawn, Vern slurred. Sorry, son, ain't my call. Eli watched him pour another drink, the keyring jingling loosely at his belt. He smiled faintly. Vern, you ever think about quitting that rot gut before it quits you? Vern chuckled. Tried once, didn't stick. Maybe tonight's the night, Eli said. The old man blinked. Why's that? Eli stood, stretching his wrists, voice calm as ever. 'Cause if you don't, you're gonna spill that whiskey all over your boots when I walk out of here. Vern frowned, confused. Then the bottle shattered as Eli lunged, looping his chains around the man's throat and twisting. A quick, brutal struggle later, Vern slumped unconscious, snoring through the floorboards. Eli pried the keys loose, unlocked his cuffs, and took one deep breath of freedom. He grabbed his hat, his Colt, and slipped into the night. Amos and Ayanna met him behind the livery stable just as dawn's first light touched the horizon. She almost didn't believe it was him. Bruised, bloodied, but still standing. You shouldn't have come, he said, voice rough. I wasn't gonna let them hang an innocent man, she replied. Eli's eyes softened. You could have been killed. Ayanna met his gaze, unwavering. So could you, Amos cleared his throat, holding up the cigar butt. We got proof. Found this at Talbot's barn. Eli took it, rolling it between his fingers. Harlow's brand. Exactly, Amos said. If we can get folks to hear us before Wade silences the town, we might stand a chance. Eli looked toward the rising sun, jaw set. Then we ride for the church. Folks gather there on Sundays. Let 'em hear it all. They didn't make it far before Cole Harlow and Slim Redden came barreling down the road, rifles drawn. Thought you'd slip away that easy? Cole sneered. Eli stepped forward, gun drawn, voice like steel. You boys ought to turn around. Ain't your day to die. Slim laughed. We'll see about that. The first shot cracked like lightning. Horses screamed. Dust exploded. Eli dove behind a wagon, firing twice. Slim's hat flew clean off. Amos returned fire, grazing Cole's shoulder. Ayanna, unflinching, picked up Vern's dropped shotgun and took aim. One blast echoed across the canyon. Slim Redden hit the ground, clutching his leg, screaming curses. Cole's face twisted with rage. You'll pay for that, woman, he shouted, spurring his horse forward. Eli's gun barked once. Cole tumbled from the saddle, hitting the dirt hard, his eyes wide with disbelief. The silence afterward was deafening, broken only by the wind through the mesquite. Ayanna lowered the shotgun, hands shaking. I didn't want this. Eli looked at her, voice steady. You wanted justice. This is what it costs. By midday, the three of them, Eli, Ayanna, and Amos, rode toward town, dragging Slim Redden bound to a horse. The church bell rang in the distance, its toll cold and hollow. Inside, Marshal Wade Harlow waited, his face calm, but eyes burning like coal. When he saw Eli walk through the doors, free and armed, something flickered in his gaze. Not fear, but the knowledge that his time was running out. Eli dropped the cigar butt on the floorboards between them. This yours, Marshal? He asked. The crowd gasped. Harlow's jaw tightened. You're digging your own grave, Boone. Eli's voice rose, clear and sharp. No, Marshal, I'm digging yours. In the West, truth rides slow, but it never rides alone. The church at Redemption Creek had never been this full. Folks packed every pew and corner, sweat and tension thick in the air. The bell still echoed from the tower outside, its last toll fading like a dying breath. Marshal Wade Harlow stood at the front with his hand resting on his gun belt, his badge catching the morning light like a blade. He looked like law incarnate until you saw his eyes. They were hollow, mean, and hungry. Across the aisle, Eli Boone walked in slow, boots echoing on the wooden floor. Dust trailed behind him like a second shadow. Ayanna and Amos Granger followed, and between them limped Slim Redden, bound, dirty, and beaten, but still breathing. Every whisper died when Eli stopped at the altar. He placed something small on the table, a half-burned cheroot cigar. Marshal, he said, voice steady. "This here's yours, ain't it?" Wade didn't blink. "Never seen it before." Eli smiled without warmth. "Then I guess it's a miracle how the same brand you smoke ends up next to Hank Talbot's body." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clyde Mercer, the storekeeper, leaned forward, whispering to his neighbor. The preacher's hands trembled at the pulpit. Ayanna stepped forward. "He killed Talbot to take the water under his land. My people called that ground sacred. He called it worth a fortune." Wade turned to the crowd, his voice rising smooth as oil. "You gonna take the word of an Apache widow and a convicted killer over the man who's kept order here for 10 years? Eli's gaze hardened. "Order ain't the same as justice." The room went still. Amos Granger tossed Slim forward. "Tell him what you told us, boy." Slim looked around, sweating. He saw the marshal's glare, the promise of hell in it. Then he looked at Eli, and something in the drifter's calm, unshaken eyes gave him courage. "It was Wade," Slim muttered. "He told me to plant the knife, said it'd shut folks up for good." The church erupted. Voices shouted, boots scuffed. People turned on each other like wolves. Wade's hand twitched toward his revolver, but Eli was faster. The Colt was out, steady, aimed dead center at the marshal's chest. "Don't," Eli warned. "You draw, you die." The room froze again. Wade's jaw flexed. "You think this town will follow an outsider?" Eli took a slow step closer. "No, Marshal. They'll follow the truth." He tossed the cigar at Wade's boots. "You tried to bury it, but you can't bury the truth forever. Not in a land this dry." Clyde Mercer shouted from the back. "He's lying! Wade's the law!" But others didn't move. Rufus Pike, the blacksmith, crossed his arms. "Law or not, I seen the marshal riding toward Talbot's the night he died." Murmurs turned to voices, voices to rage. Wade realized it then. His hold on the town was breaking. "You don't know what you're doing," he barked. "You need me! Without me, this place'll eat itself alive!" Ayanna spoke, her voice quiet but clear as thunder. "Maybe it's time we learn to feed ourselves." The marshal's hand flashed, metal gleamed, a gunshot cracked through the church. Ayanna gasped as the bullet tore through her sleeve, grazing her arm. Before Wade could fire again, Eli's revolver thundered. The marshal staggered back, clutching his chest, his badge falling to the floor with a dull clang. He hit the altar, then the ground, his blood soaking into the wooden boards where folks used to pray. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the broken church door. No one moved for a long time. Eli holstered his gun and turned to the people staring at him, half in fear, half in awe. "Justice ain't clean," he said quietly. "Never was. But it's the only thing that keeps a town alive." Then he looked at Ayanna, who stood pale but steady, pressing her hand to the wound. She met his eyes, and for the first time in that church's long, silent history, something holy filled the room. Not fear, not law, but mercy. By noon, Wade Harlow was dead. Slim Redden was locked in his own cell, and Redemption Creek began to breathe again. The townsfolk walked out into the sun, blinking like they'd never seen daylight before. Clyde Mercer quietly took down the "No Natives Served" sign that had hung in his store window for years. Rufus Pike helped rebuild Ayanna's garden fence. Amos Granger oversaw the burial of Hank Talbot beside the old creek. And Eli Boone, the man they'd once called a drifter, stayed to help fix what was broken, plank by plank, fence by fence. That evening, the sun dipped low and red over the ridge. The whole sky looked like it was on fire again. But this time, it wasn't a memory of loss. It was something closer to rebirth. Eli and Ayanna stood by the riverbank. Her arm was wrapped, her hair loose in the wind. "He's gone," she said softly. "After all these years, the land can breathe again." Eli nodded, staring at the water. "Ain't just the land. Maybe the both of us, too." Ayanna smiled faintly. "You'll be leaving soon, won't you?" He took a deep breath. "I was thinking about it, but maybe for once I'll stop running." She looked up at him, her dark eyes calm. "The desert remembers every footstep, Eli. Stay long enough, and it might remember yours kindly." He chuckled, that low, tired sound of a man who'd finally found a reason to laugh. You really think a place like this can forgive a man like me? Ayanna reached for his hand, fingers intertwining with his. It's not the land that forgives. It's the people brave enough to start over. The night came slow and tender. The townsfolk lit lamps in the windows again, not for fear, but for light. The saloon doors stayed open, laughter spilling out instead of curses. At the edge of town, Eli and Ayanna stood by the fence line, watching buckshot graze under the moonlight. Eli said quietly, "Maybe it ain't about finding peace. Maybe it's about earning it." Ayanna smiled. "Then you've earned it, cowboy." He looked at her, eyes soft but certain. "No, ma'am. We both did." Before dawn, Eli saddled up buckshot, his shadow stretching long across the ground. Ayanna watched from the porch, a blanket draped around her shoulders. "Where will you go?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon, the endless desert, the same place all lost men stare when they're finally found. "Wherever the trail leads," he said. "But I'll be back. You got my word." She nodded slowly. "I'll hold you to it." Eli smiled, tipping his hat. "I know you will." He kicked gently at the stirrup, and buckshot started forward. The wind carried the scent of sage, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Ayanna stood there long after he disappeared from view. The dawn broke golden and quiet over Redemption Creek, bathing the town in the light of something new. Weeks later, they'd still talk about the day the marshal fell and how a drifter and an Apache woman gave the town back its soul. Some said it was justice. Others called it fate. But the old folks who'd seen both good men and bad come and go said it best. Every frontier's got its ghosts, but sometimes one man with a conscience is enough to lay him to rest. Epilogue, the question. And as the sun rose over that tired little town, a question hung in the wind, one for everyone who ever watched a wrong go unpunished. When the law itself becomes the outlaw, who will you be? The one who hides behind silence, or the one who stands and fights? Some stories end with peace, others end with a beginning.